Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fifth episode of The News Bust. Today, we're all together and we have four interesting stories for you. So, let's get started with the first one.
So the first one is about the Chinese rocket. The large Chinese rocket that's out of control and is set to re-enter Earth's atmosphere past weekend had brought about an alarming but not unprecedented situation. So space debris has crashed into Earth a number of occasions, including last year. But the Chinese rocket that was set to enter the Earth's atmosphere this weekend, is designed in a way that leaves the big stages in low orbit. So, is there any regulation in place for like debris? In 1967, Outer Space Treaty, which remains the primary international document regulating activity in outer space, was agreed at a time to when only two governments were going in space. Now that more countries and more companies are in the business of spaceflight, regulators are faced with a catch 22, which is basically they don't want to create any lawless environment, but they're resistant to impose new rules for fear that other countries might become more dominant in space. But space is intrinsically global, right? Like a satellite passes over all countries in the world in a few hours. So by having by making US take a position, it's not going to really solve anything. To really need what they really need is some kind of international space traffic management agency, something like an air traffic control, but for space, but international. So pinpointing where the debris is headed is almost impossible because of the speed that the rocket is traveling in. Even a slight change in the time in the speed that they're traveling in could change the trajectory. So what they thought was that it may land somewhere between the 8th and the 10th of May. And in that 2 day period, it went around the world about 3 times, so 30 times. And the thing was traveling about at 18,000 miles per hour. So even if they're off by an hour, it like they're already off by 18,000 miles, like from where they expected it to land. So, but they expect that the ocean still remains the safest bet for where it's going to land because it takes up most of the Earth's surface. China's Space Administration stayed silent for days amid criticism that allowing such a large rocket stage to free fall towards the Earth was really irresponsible and it posed a safety risk. It may be a small one, but it could also be a really big one if it landed in countries. Finally, on Sunday morning, Beijing time, the China Manned Space Engineering Office broke its silence, confirming the remains of the rocket had plunged into the Indian Ocean near the Maldives after most of it had burned up in the atmosphere. For many who have followed the rocket's return, the news came as a big relief. In China, it was not only seen as a vindication of the rocket's design, but also used as state media to argue that intense global attention was merely a Western effort to discredit China's space program and cut its progress. While Beijing has long accused Western countries and media of holding China to a different standard, Chinese officials have also routinely had a national response to any criticism branding its ill-intended attempt to smear China. So, such fierce defensiveness is particularly evident when it comes to China's space program, an important point of national pride for Chinese public and its source of prestige. Defensiveness to criticism from the West, especially from the US, is partially born out of what Beijing perceives as Washington's hostility to block its progress beyond Earth's atmosphere. Since 1999, the US has imposed export controls on satellite technology to China. And in 2012, Congress passed a law that imposed restrictions on NASA's engagement in China. The Chinese astronauts have also been banned from International Space Station, which is the only space station in orbit and a collaboration between the US, Russia, Europe, and other countries. As a result, China is building its own space station, the Taigong, which means heavenly place in Chinese. And last month, it had officially launched its first module, the rocket that drew the world's scrutiny. In blaming the West for this smear campaign, however, Chinese state media and space experts omitted to explain why the Long March 5B had caused anxiety amongst global scientists. Yeah. So, what are your opinions on this?
Well, that's definitely an interesting story. I find that it was initially unfair that the European countries and America decided to exclude China. And I still think that China deciding to do their own thing and still send something to space is quite amazing in its own way. And I don't disagree with the fact that they did it, because space is such an unknown, there's so many unknown things about it that I think it's necessary that more countries need to go into space so that we can have as much data as possible and learn as much as possible. However, I do think that if you're going to take up the challenge of sending something to space, you need to evaluate all the risks to make sure that something like this doesn't happen. I mean, they sent the whole thing up in space. And and then no one knew where it was going to land. It could have had drastic consequences. So many people could have died. They were lucky it landed in the ocean, but it could have had devastating consequences. I mean, not only on the country that would have crashed in, but then China would have obviously had to pay for the damages, and that would have had quite a devastating impact on China because that would have been expensive.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I also like the point that it landed in the ocean. It could also cause like lots of global global warming and stuff. It can like increase those stuff, right? So yeah, they should actually take those into consideration when they're actually making those like important decisions too.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, honestly, I would add more, but honestly, Anael had said everything I want to say, as well as Hannah. Like,
environmental factors are really like huge, and also the fact that I think it's not only China's fault that it's just US blaming them, and they're trying to put like blame on China, but it's not all China's fault, because the US should have included other countries like China and other like even India, like they're really growing developing countries that are really like getting into the space and everything like that. And so they should have included them already and allowed Chinese astronauts to also go to International Space Station to collect data, but they didn't, and that's what led to China releasing their own space station. And I think that's what led to all this. So definitely, I think the US should consider looking at adding different countries and letting them into the International Space Station.
Yeah, because when you think about it, China's a very rich country, and they could contribute a lot. And like Hannah said, it's quite, the rocket falling into the ocean is quite damaging because it can damage the ecosystem underneath it. And that in itself, like, we already have enough global warming destroying the coral reefs, so we don't need this.
Yeah. Plus, there's also the chance of like hurting. Well, there's the ecosystem, which will then affect the like animals and stuff. Like animals, plants.
So, while talking about climate, let's go on to Anael's story, which also relates to climate.
Quite a lot, yes, it does. So, we're talking about kids that are taking over government, not taking over, but the kids are taking governments to court over climate, and they are starting to win. So, a 25-year-old climate activist by the name of Luisa Neuber has taken the German government to court last year and has recently won. On April 29th, Germany's Supreme Court announced that some arrangements of the 2019 Climate Change Act were unconstitutional and incompatible with fundamental rights because they lacked a detailed plan for reducing emissions and placed a burden for future climate actions on the younger generations. The court thereby ordered the government to come up with a new set of arrangements that specify in greater detail how the reduction targets for greenhouse gas emissions by the end of next year. The decision made headlines across the world. During an interview with CNN, Neuber said it was hard to digest because it was so unexpected, stating that even though it was her name on the case, Neuber et al. Versus Germany, she was far from being the only person involved. This case changes everything, she said. It's not nice to have climate action. It's our fundamental right that the government protects us from the climate crisis. Peter Altmaier, Germany's Minister for Energy and the Economy, called the court's finding significant and a historic decision for climate and the rights of young people. Climate lawsuits are becoming increasingly popular and a powerful tool for many climate change activists. A January report released by the United Nations Environment Programme found that the number of climate litigation cases filed around the world nearly doubled between 2017 and 2020. Crucially, the governments are starting to lose. Neuber's victory came just months after a court in Paris ruled that France was legally responsible for its failure to meet emission-cutting targets. A similar case took place in Portugal by a group of 6 people and was fast-tracked at the European Court of Human Rights last October. Mark Clark, a partner at the international law firm White & Case, says that not only are there more climate cases being brought forward, there's also a shift in the way they are being framed. The most significant trend is the pivot away from claims for damages as a result of the physical impacts of climate change towards rights-based claims, he said. The main claim of the trials is the idea that future generations have a right to live in a world that is not completely decimated by the climate crisis. Neuber and her co-claimants argued that the current German government's failure to have a concrete plan to reduce emissions beyond 2030 would make their lives more difficult because they'd be forced to confront the catastrophic impact of climate change in the future. The 2019 law called for a 55% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 from the 1990 levels. The lawsuit argued that the target wasn't sufficient to meet Germany's obligations under the Paris Accord. Under the agreement, most signing countries pledged to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius and as close as 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, or the IPCC, has said that warming of more than 2 degrees would have devastating consequences, including sea level rise, frequent heat waves, extreme weather, and droughts. Gary Liston, the head of climate litigation at Global Legal Action Network, or GLAN, said the German Constitutional Court was not so much talking about the impact of climate change on young people, but the impact of mitigation measures. He followed by saying, if action is delayed, it will require vastly greater emission reductions in the future that would impose a massive burden on those alive then. Liston is representing the 6 young Portuguese people who have taken 33 governments to the European Court of Human Rights over their failure to act on the climate crisis. Aged between 9 and 22, they are already experiencing its effect. 4 of them are from Leiria in Portugal, a region devastated by deadly wildfires in 2017. The fires killed at least 62 people, some of which were burned alive while in their cars trying to escape the fires. Joanna Setzer, a student of the London School of Economics, Grantham Research Institute of Climate Change and the Environment, said that the fact that so many of the climate cases are brought by young people makes them more powerful because children and young adults can legitimately argue they will face the worst impacts of the climate crisis in the future. In an interview with CNN, she openly stated, "These kids, they found their voice. They went to the streets and they were there shouting in front of parliaments. And when they couldn't go to the streets anymore because of social distancing and COVID, they went to court." Governments around the world have been coming up with increasingly ambitious climate targets in the recent years. But according to UN Climate Chief Patricia Espinosa, many have so far failed to set out plans on how to reach them. Now they are being held accountable for their promise. Louisa Nogueira said, "The government seems to still mix up setting climate targets with doing climate action. It's 2 different things. Targets cannot replace what the government does now. And what the government does right now is basically preventing us from reaching those targets." Well, what do you guys think?
Yeah, so I think, the new generation, like it's really important for them to realize that, climate is a big deal, especially for us, because, our parents, they've already finished, like they've gone through it and like, but our future is what's changing, our future when we become their age, like it's not going to be as good in terms of the environment, the climate. So, it's up to us to save the future for us. And it's also, I think, these children and these like kids going to court and actually like presenting a whole case about it, it's important because it spreads awareness in like even the parents and the older generations, because I think it's more important for the older generations to be aware of this stuff and actually like get to know about it, because we learn about it in school, so we know more about it and we know more about what's going on with the world in terms of climate. But I think going to court will definitely like raise the awareness and spread to like the older generations as well. And yeah, what about you, Marianne?
Yeah, so I think it's actually really good. Like you can see that the younger generation is actually starting to take action, and some of the actions that they're taking is actually beneficial. And it really, but as you said, it really does help to spread awareness on this issue on both the old and the newer generations of the world. And well, yeah, I hope that this will progress in the future and that governments will, instead of setting targets, will actually start to take action towards their targets and hopefully do a proper positive impact on the world.
Yeah, and also like they're going against the government because they couldn't reach their target. But I also think that to reach their target, the citizens also have to stand up to make it like better. And going to the court will spread more awareness about the climate issues. And I hope it actually works better now.
I think that's so true because I think the governments like they make the laws and everything.
Yeah.
They put like plans, but then I think it's the citizens that they have to like actually be aware of those plans. Like until I learned it in school, I wasn't aware of those plans. So when I learned it in school, I was like, oh, like UAE actually has these plans, or this country actually made this, but like they're really never able to achieve it by their goal and by the goal they
Yeah.
set. So I think it's important for the citizens to realize that the government, like, this is the goals they've made, and this is like what they should achieve, and so work towards those.
What I think is also very important is that they set out realistic goals, and that they don't say by 2030 we want to eliminate climate change, we want to eliminate global warming. I think they need to be realistic in their targets, make them achievable, and not extravagantly just huge and just try to solve everything in 10 years. That's right now that's impossible. So yeah.
Also, because it's like our generation who uses like lots of SNS and like social medias, it's more easier to like spread the awareness, right? So it will be easier to actually take an action towards it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I think that people who don't believe in climate change need to wake up and start seeing the facts and understanding and believing and seeing climate change is real. There's right now we're in a time and it's a crisis and we need to fix it. And stop saying climate change isn't real. Climate change doesn't affect anyone. I think people need to stand up straight, look at the facts, and stop acting like sheep, hearing it from one person saying, that person said it's not real, therefore it's not real. So I just think people need to look at the facts and act accordingly.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're on to our third story then?
Okay, then moving on to the next news. It's about COVID vaccine exemption from intellectual property rights. On the 5th of May, US President Joe Biden officially said that he supports calls for exemption from intellectual property rights to expand production of COVID-19 vaccines. By temporarily allowing the production of cloned vaccines, the US regained its international leadership, and lawmakers from around the world have also put pressure on the lack of vaccines and imbalance in supply and demand. If Pfizer and others give up their intellectual property rights to COVID-19 vaccines, companies in other countries can also manufacture cloned vaccines without paying patent fees. The US Trade Representative said it supported the waiver of vaccine patents to end the coronavirus, and it would actively engage in negotiations with the World Trade Organization. However, it said that it will take time because it needs an agreement from member countries, because all 164 WTO members must agree to exempt the right to hold vaccines. Meanwhile, some of the countries are saying against this policy. At the EU summit in Porto, Portugal, leaders from Germany, France, and Italy argued the US to increase exports of vaccines and raw materials before discussing the exemption. The German government argued that they support the global supply of COVID-19 vaccines, but the biggest constraint in vaccine production is not intellectual property rights, but production growth and quality guarantees. German Chancellor Merkel said the exemption of vaccine intellectual property rights is not a solution to the supply shortage, adding that it is time for the US to provide vaccines and raw materials to the world. The EU has been supplying vaccines produced in Europe to the world, and this has to be an international standard. The EU has exported 200 million doses of vaccine to countries around the world, but the US has blocked exports to vaccines and raw materials by using the Defense Material Production Act. And some pointed out that the exemption of intellectual property rights alone does not mean much. They argue that production will not increase significantly, even if intellectual property rights are exempted, as vaccines are already being made at maximum in production facilities. In addition to releasing patents for vaccines, it is explained that disclosure of production secrets or manufacturing technologies will help increase production. The World Health Organization Secretary General Theodros Adhanom tweeted, "It is a monumental moment in the fight against COVID-19." The Washington Post advised, as important as the exemption of intellectual property rights, vaccine-related infrastructure such as vaccine manufacturing know-how, skilled persons, and quality control methods are shared around the world. The International Pharmaceutical Association Federation, which includes Pfizer, is protesting, saying that the solution is to resolve the shortage of vaccine ingredients and the willingness of rich countries to share vaccines with poor countries. So yeah, this is it. What's your opinion about it?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Oh, ooh, for once I'm a bit stuck on words.
Okay, so I'd like to take it from you if it's okay.
Please do.
Okay, so moving intellectual property rights on COVID-19 vaccine is obviously amazing because it allows foreign trade. And for, as you mentioned, the EU shared their vaccines with other countries, and that's amazing because, like, especially right now, like India, well, not really India, but other countries that have not made their own vaccine. Like India has their own vaccine, so they're using the same vaccine in their country. But suppose like some places like UAE and other like countries like, I don't know, Russia maybe, where they haven't created their own vaccine, they need that supply of vaccinations from the countries like EU and the US and other countries that have the vaccine, like have the availability. Because in US they have Pfizer and Moderna, and in India and UK they've made AstraZeneca together. So they have the supply because they made it. But other countries that have not made their own vaccines, like they need that supply. And so removing the intellectual trade property rights, obviously it helps a lot for countries that are in like desperate need for vaccinations. And yeah, that's what I think for now. So I think that's a really good move from the US.
I also think that it helps to create a certain type of bond between people. When you think that we're in a global pandemic, it affects everybody. Everyone is affected, and that the countries that are rich enough and advanced enough to have the research to make their own vaccines, they don't just close themselves up and say, no, it's my vaccine, I'm keeping it. That they're willing to share it. I think that develops certain bond between countries, and I think that it further pushes the point that we're all in this together and we all need to help each other move forwards, move beyond this pandemic. We need to achieve herd immunity, and we need to get out of this pandemic. If we're going to grow and if we're going to live any differently than we are now, wearing masks everywhere we go. I think that it's a very special thing that we are sharing vaccines and that we're trying our best to achieve herd immunity. Does anyone have anything else to say?
Well, I guess, well, oh.
That's okay, go on.
Well, hopefully with the EU and the US like helping with the like spread of vaccinations, hopefully it will help reduce the amount of time we will need to kind of recuperate from the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Definitely.
So let's move on to our next story, Mariette.
Okay,
so on to the last and final topic, which is about the Queen's first cousin allegedly trading on links to Putin and monarchy. So with the UK media report. So Prince Michael is the first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II and has often appeared alongside her during royal engagements. His maternal and paternal grandfathers are the first cousins of Tsar Nikolai II, and has been visiting Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, according to his website. Prince Michael of Kent said on Sunday that he has no special relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin after an undercover journalist investigation claimed that he is a very close friend and were secretly trading on their links with Putin for profit. So the report centers around undercover recordings of a Zoom meeting involving Prince Michael and his friend and business partner, Simon Isaac, whose title is the Marquess of Reading, and two undercover journalists posing as executives of a fake South Korean company that invests in gold. The investigation by the UK Sunday Times and Channel 4 does not allege Prince Michael or Isaac, took part in any illegal activity. According to the Sunday Times, their undercover reporters claimed the fictitious South Korean company was looking to hire a royal to market its investment services, and wrote in a letter that it was planning to set up a Moscow office and offering to hire the prince as an advisor as his excellent contacts in Russia. So the prince told the undercover journalist on a Zoom call, "I've traveled extensively around Russia for many different reasons, but mainly on business," clips of which were posted on by the Sunday Times. In the Zoom call after the prince had left the meeting, Isaac goes on to say, in Russia, the prince is not seen as political and is seen as a friend of Russia. He adds that Prince Michael is highly regarded due to his royal family heritage, and that he is just generally regarded as His Highness's unofficial ambassador to Russia. Prince Michael's spokesperson in Sunday's statement said that he never represented Buckingham Palace in Russia or elsewhere. So what do you guys think?
From what I remember,
yeah, you want to go first?
Sure, okay. So from what I remember was before UK was also, the royals in the UK were also under fire for hiding stuff and really keeping their news private. And so I think we talked about it in the previous podcast as well. And so I think the same applies here. And I think, the fact that they're being so private and everything, they're keeping secrets from the world. And so I think when this came out, I think it really damages their royal reputation. And well, when he travels to Russia, it's kind of obvious that he's representing UK no matter what. And he's representing the Buckingham Palace no matter what, even if he's going there to go on a vacation. So I think they should have considered the fact that if he's going there so many times, or if he's visiting there, he is a representative of the Buckingham Palace. And so I think they should have thought of this. And but I think that the royal family has so much control over the news media, the media agencies in the UK, that they did not let out the news. And so when it came out now, I don't know about other people, but I was very surprised. So yeah,
because it's, as you said, the royal family needs to keep this facade up of being the royal family. They need to be this regal family. They need to be pretty much perfect, because they're royals. It's the way they're portrayed. And I think that so many things happen behind the scenes that they don't want to get out. And still having the second cousin visit Russia so much, and everything that goes on there is kept hush hush, is a bit suspicious, because you're like, that's suspicious. And no matter where you go, it's, as you said, no matter where you go, your royal status doesn't change. So no matter where you go, in a sense, whatever you do, your actions will reflect on the Buckingham Palace, on the royal family. So going back and forth in between England and Russia so many times, obviously someone's going to question what's going on here. Even if they're a family, even if they have some kind of family, did you say it was godfather relationship or something? They have some kind of...
Yeah, they're his grandfathers from his maternal and parental sides, right, were the first cousins of the Tsar Nikolai II.
Right. And even if they have this blood connection, there's still going to be questions of why is this so frequent? Yeah. What are you speaking of? What are you doing? But I think people are also being a little bit too suspicious, and maybe you should think that maybe it is just a family thing. Maybe it is just, I want to visit my family and I have the money to do so, so I will. So I think that it can go both ways, really.
I think it's probably due to his public, what was it called? Public status. Because of that, people are always interested and they investigate, and maybe due to him being part of the royal family, they try to find some sort of way to accuse him of something bad that could, in all honesty, be something completely, well, I won't say irrelevant, but it could be something made up or just a conspiracy theory,
Yeah, because it's quite, imagine if you found something, imagine if you accuse a member of the royal family of corruption, that's a huge news headline.
Yeah.
So really,
Exactly,
you
yeah.
can't blame journalists for trying to do their jobs.
Hannah,
Yeah.
what do you think?
I mean, basically, you guys talked all about it. So like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I strongly agree with that. Like, because they're a loyal family, like they should know that media is always following them. But then in other way, like Anel said, like you guys said, like there could be just like family, like it could be just something just like informal. But like, yeah.
Yeah, I think that sums it up. So I think we have had really great 4 stories for today. A little bit lighthearted for this podcast, and I think that's kind of nice because going into a festival, the Eid festival, I think we should be a little happy. So guys, take care and see you next time.
Bye.
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 Thank you for watching.